The murder of several cartoonists at the satirical French magazine Charlie Hebdo in January left many shocked and horrified. But along with the global outpouring of sympathy for France, there's been criticism too for alleged hypocrisy when it comes to free speech. Critics say that while France has strong anti-Semitism laws, none exist to protect against anti-Islamic sentiments. France is also the only Western nation to ban pro-Palestinian demonstrations. So is free speech an absolute, and what's the difference between free speech and hate propaganda? Joining us to discuss the issue is Sharif Nashashibi, a journalist and also the chairman of a media watchdog organization that monitors British media coverage in the Arab world. Sharif joins us from London. Suzanne Nossel, the executive director of the PEN American Center organization, which defends free expression in the literary world. Munir Pervez Sami, a Canadian Muslim activist, he joins us from Toronto. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Sharif, in London, let me start with you. You know, after those killings, those gruesome killings in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo murders, as it became to be known, there was a great deal of publicity. There was a huge protest. We know that millions of people took part. We saw all those leaders walk down the street in Paris. Yet, immediately after that, several mosques were attacked in France. We didn't hear much about that. Why is that?
Well, precisely, and this gets down to the bottom of the issue of double standards, is there was a very worrying lack of reporting about these reprisal attacks. And this is very worrying because there is a general sense in France and in other countries in the West of alienation among the Muslim community. And there was a great deal of fear from them following this Charlie Hebdo attack that there would be these reprisals, and indeed there were, and the media simply didn't cover it. And that is a real problem.
Suzanne, in the wake of those murders in France, we had a comedian who was arrested and questioned by French authorities for making statements that were considered anti-Semitic. We had even an 8-year-old boy in France who was questioned because of things he said about that attack. Did France overreact in the wake of that attack, as some believe the United States overreacted after the 9/11 attacks?
Well, I think there was some of that, you know, a sense of this impulsive need to crack down on everybody, even an 8-year-old boy who might have errant points of view or points of view that could justify violence. Perhaps some of that is inevitable, but I do think it's crucially important that officials kind of keep their heads on straight and recognize that retaliating against Muslim communities has a very good chance of making worse the exact types of impulses that they're now trying to control.
Munir, you are in Canada, and you've said that Islamists have abused Canadian liberties. I mean, there is a tendency in the Western media to equate people who call themselves Islamists, people who may follow the faith very closely and very faithfully, with people who also have adopted violence as a path. I mean, could you explain for us, well, initially, who are Islamists?
Yeah, so let me first explain as to what I do. I'm with Muslim Canadian Congress, and we stand for secularism all around the world. And we see double standard on the other side, actually. For example, you just mentioned the French comedian Dieudonné, who was punished multiple times for his thought, which is pure anti-Semitic speech, which he professes and he kind of promotes all the time. But on the other side, people who raise the flag of Islamophobia all the time never mention. I have not seen them mentioning that Brigitte Bardot, the icon of the French culture and arts, has also been punished 6 times for raising racism against Muslims. So when we say that there is hypocrisy for those who clamor for freedom of speech, in France it is, I don't see that happening in France. And we are among those in Canada, those Muslims who stood in front of a mosque saying that we are Charlie Hebdo. And when I see that somebody is raising, I am the killer of Charlie Hebdo, that really baffles me, and that really something that the whole Muslim world lament.
Sure,
I think you have to draw...
Go ahead, Suzanne.
I was just going to say, I think we have to draw a distinction between two things. There's the response at a societal level, you know, people's own points of view, what editorials, opinion leaders are saying, versus what government does, whether it is prosecuting people, jailing people. I think those are two very different things. People will apply a double standard. There are going to be people with all kinds of different points of view. I think what we have to scrutinize most closely is when governments treat different kinds of expression differently based on the target that it's directed toward.
Sharif, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, Look, I think the issue here, not just with Charlie Hebdo, but for instance with the publication of the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad with a Danish newspaper, it is down to the double standards in the use of the freedom of speech argument. And I've been monitoring the British media here on how they portray Arabs and Muslims for 10 years. And I can tell you unequivocally that there are things that the mainstream media will readily say about Muslims that they would never say about other communities. And I'll give you one example. I gave a talk once at a community event about talking about kind of intercommunal relations in Britain. I started off saying things, some pretty awful things about Jews and blacks. And people started heckling me, people started leaving the room. And actually all I was doing was quoting the British mainstream press. I just replaced the word Muslim with the word Jew or black. And that showed that there were things that were simply unacceptable to say about other communities, and yet it seemed to be fair game for Muslims. And this comes down to the real issue. It is an issue of double standards. When the Danish newspaper says that they will happily publish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, but not cartoons that offend Jews or Christians, and when Charlie Hebdo fires someone over allegations of anti-Semitism, this is double standard. It's not about freedom of expression per se. It is about double standards.
Munir?
Okay, so let me, the double standards are actually on the other side. For example, who mentioned that Najib Mahfouz, who is a Nobel laureate in Egypt, was attacked for his thought? That's never brought out in any debate by the people who raise the flag of Islamophobia all the time. Can somebody say that Salman Rushdie wrote his novel because he was against the marginalized Muslims in UK? That's totally wrong. So the double standard comes from the other side, because I belong to a community, and just for Suzanne's information, I was a board member of PEN Canada, fighting for the rights of the writers, and also fighting against censorship in Canada. So I have been targeted with death threats in Canada. My friends in Muslim Canadian Congress, Tariq Fatah, Farzan Hassan, have been targeted with death threats in Canada for just trying to raise the moderate voice or the secular voice of the Muslims. So to say that we are having double standard, I'm a Muslim, okay, and unfortunately Islam is targeted because throughout the world, especially in Pakistan where I hail from, people are killed every second day because they are even accused of blasphemy. The governor of Punjab was killed, and Salman Taseer should know very well, and his killer has been deemed as a hero. His defenders, who have been former justices of the Punjab High Court, are hailing the killers of Charlie Hebdo as a hero. So once you have created such a mentality of all around that if you speak, we will kill you, unfortunately, there will be reprisal and targets. And I agree that the states should not target the other citizens, and Suzanne should know, and Sharif should know, that the anti-race laws, anti-racism laws have been brought in for the curtailing the abuse of free speech. France has the harshest anti-speech laws, and even in USA, despite all the amendments in 1952, the blasphemy law was repealed. And we have just signed a coalition of blasphemy, abolition of blasphemy everywhere. So we have got one straightforward agenda, which is that the Muslims should be very willing to accept free speech. They should say what they want to say, and they're allowed to say that in Canada and many other countries, and they should then give the others the right to speak also.
So, Suzanne, do we have a situation here where different groups are treated differently, as Sharif has pointed out to us? For instance, in France, if you criticize, if you deny rather the Holocaust, that's an offense, as it rightly is. But if you criticize Muslims, if you denigrate them, that's okay.
Well, there are some double standards. I think there's no question about it. It's hard to explain how Holocaust denial prohibitions are consistent with free speech. In the United States, such prohibitions would never be accepted. Now, you can understand it at some level as a historical artifact that came out of a particular era, but I think it does give rise to questions, particularly when double standards are enshrined in law. So I do believe that's something we need to work toward addressing. I think the question of double standards in how populations respond to ideas, how they feel about different groups, that's more deep-seated. It does need to be addressed. Certainly some groups feel more vulnerable and more targeted than others, and those feelings of vulnerability can manifest themselves in destabilizing and sometimes dangerous ways. So that is something we ought to all be concerned about, how to make people feel like they're treated equally, not just under the law, but in terms of their daily dealings, how they see their group portrayed in newspaper articles or in cartoons. If one group feels consistently singled out, threatened, that has negative consequences across the society.
Sharif, is the problem here?
Anand, I want to step in here before Sharif, if you allow me to.
Okay.
And I mean, basically, what I want to point out here is this PEN USA only recently published multiple cartoons in solidarity with Charlie Hebdo. The Charlie Hebdo people have created cartoons against the Jews, and the biggest difficult cartoon was where somebody is showing that discount 1 million for your 6 million for the Palestinians. So it's not the Charlie Hebdos of the world are creating hate against the people. And let me tell you why the anti-Semitic or what you call the anti-Holocaust laws are important, because we in Muslim, and I'm a Muslim, I practice Islam. I have lived in Saudi Arabia and Middle East and UAE and Bahrain and everywhere for a long, long time. And every second day you hear the chants that Israel is the enemy on all of their television. Al Jazeera may not show, but Saudi television, Bahrain television, Qatar television, when the news comes in, the first thing comes, Al-Adu is Israeli, the Israeli enemy. So no, let me just finish. So we talk about killing Jews every second day. So unfortunately, denial of Holocaust leads to killing of the Jews in the Muslim community, and I am against that.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a moment. Sharif, let me give you a chance to respond.
I find this kind of puzzling. I mean, you know, no one on this show is saying that you know, calling for the killing of anyone from any community is fine. But you know, if you're thinking that the sense of Muslim alienation in the West is somehow a fabrication, I mean, you are, with all due respect, very out of touch with mainstream Muslim feeling in these countries. We cannot say, well, you know, what Charlie Hebdo does is fine because what happens in Pakistan or Saudi Arabia is bad. I mean, you know, I'm a journalist. Of course I'm pro-freedom of speech. The problem here is, the first thing I learned as a journalist is with freedom of speech comes a responsibility. And unfortunately, what we have here, particularly pertaining to the Muslim community, is that people want to exercise this right of free speech without any consideration of the responsibility. And it is not simply an issue of Muslims. I mean, Jews, blacks, gays, they have all experienced this vilification in the media and elsewhere. So this is an issue of how minorities are vilified and how they are allowed to be vilified under this banner of freedom of speech without thought to whether this is responsible or not.
Okay. We're going to take a break right now. Sorry, Munir, one moment. We want to take a break right now. We'll get back to this issue in just a moment. We will look at the situation and ask the question, is France an unequal opportunity offender? Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.